Okay, so it's 7:02, so I think we'll begin. Good evening. My name is Leora Miller, and I'm the Vice President of the National Council of Jewish Women of Australia. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all meeting today, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. There are many cultural resonances between our peoples, including our experience of intergenerational and ongoing trauma and our spiritual connection to land. Jewish indigeneity in the land of Israel is central to our understanding of ourselves, and the vast majority of Jewish Australians are connected to Israel by culture and religion, birth, family, and friends there. It's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Niki Vincent. From teenage mum to Victoria's first Gender Equality Commissioner, Dr. Vincent's journey is anything but conventional. We really look forward to hearing about that journey tonight. Today, she leads the implementation of Australia's first Gender Equality Act, impacting hundreds of organisations and nearly 500,000 workers. With a PhD in psychology and a career spanning public service, academia, and community leadership, she's a nationally recognised leader known for her integrity, clarity of purpose, and commitment to equity. Commissioner Vincent will be interviewed tonight by Amy Roshman, an Executive Director at Infrastructure Advisory Group with over 15 years' experience advising on major government transactions. A personal connection adds a special touch to today's conversation. One of Dr. Vincent's daughters, Kyla and Amy, were in the same year at school in Adelaide, making this both a professional dialogue and a meaningful reconnection. There'll be an opportunity for questions, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Leora, and hi, everyone. As you said, Leora, my name is Amy Roshman, and it's my privilege to speak with Dr. Niki Vincent tonight. As the title of our event suggests, Niki has had a pretty remarkable both professional and personal journey, culminating, not that I'm suggesting that you're at all at your peak, in the role of the inaugural Victorian Gender Equality Commissioner. Tonight, I thought we would briefly talk about that journey. I feel like it's a bit trite to say the word journey, but it really has been, and I look forward to having everybody else hear your story and talk about how you ended up in the role that you're in now. And if we can talk about some highlights along the way, some key learnings from your first term and your goals and plans for your second term. So that's kind of our plan for tonight. I also want to pick your brain about lots of things, but a little bit about how we might apply those lessons on gender equality to the not-for-profit sector and for our community in general. So I'm going to start by saying, married at 18, 4 kids by 25, finished your studies whilst working part-time then as a single mum. That's a lot. That's a very big place to start. What drove you in those early days to keep studying, to keep persisting? You started very young, and you've done so much since then. How were you motivated in those early years?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's been anything but a linear path. That's absolutely for sure, and I'm sure that's something a lot of women can relate to. I came to Australia when I was 11. We were £10 POMs. In fact, it was the second time that my father had tried to get us to Australia, that he didn't have the £100 in his bank account the first time that you needed to be a £10 POM. So we were very poor. I grew up in the northern suburbs of Adelaide, where expectations were pretty limited, especially for girls. I don't think I ever went to the city. It was something that you just didn't do. So my world was very small. I had a troubled kind of childhood. I was assaulted by my best friend's father, sexually assaulted by my best friend's father at the age of 12. And then quite a sort of troubled teenage years, probably as a result of that. Nobody got therapy about that sort of stuff back in those days. We just kind of put it aside and forget about it. And I ended up getting kicked out of home when I was 15. I got married. I think at 18 I got married, but I think I got married because I just wanted some stability and security in my life. And then, as you say, Amy had 4 children by 25, and I remember some of those really kind of pivotal experiences of kind of shame for me, I think, when I was a young mum. One in particular is when I was walking along the street and we couldn't afford a twin stroller. I had 2 little ones. They were only 16 months apart, Kyla and her sister Tammy, and we'd bought these 2 cheap strollers from Kmart, and we screwed them together and they didn't work very well. And I was trying to get the 2 bubs in this contraption up over a curb and across a crossing, and I could see these 2 police officers watching me struggle over the curb, and I wondered what they were looking at me for. And when I got over there, one said to me, smirking, he said, "Serves you right." And it was a serves you right for having children so young. And it was a real kind of smack in the face. It felt like a real shame experience. And also, Tammy, unfortunately, when she was 8 months old, had a brain aneurysm, and I could see what she was going through. Like she couldn't move the left side of her body. She was grey. She had a high-pitched scream, and I took her to hospital and no one took any notice of me, and they ended up discharging her about a day later. And I said, you know, this isn't okay. And finally they did a spinal tap, and they said, "Oh, sorry, we found something wrong." But they just took one look at me and just discarded, you know, my own knowledge and awareness of my own daughter and what was going on for her. And I think whilst, you know, those experiences did shrink my world, they also, and for a while they shrank my world. I was very ashamed of them. I was ashamed of being a person who was so negatively judged by others. I was ashamed of struggling, but those things also made me really angry and determined. And I was always a feminist from my early high school days, and probably before then actually, because I have a brother and I witnessed how incredibly unfairly he was treated. I was treated compared to him. You know, he got a lot more privilege and advantage than I did, and I felt that was really unfair. But back then I was more of a liberal feminist, I would say. I didn't really question the systems themselves. I just believed that women should have equal access to them. But of course that risks encouraging women to contort themselves to fit patriarchal systems rather than changing those systems. And that's certainly what I felt I needed to do, was fit myself to systems. And that's kind of where the shame came from, because I didn't fit. And I didn't really think deeply about race or class or disability and other intersecting barriers back then, but I was definitely experiencing the intersection of gender and class discrimination myself. And I have a foster daughter that I've had for nearly 10 years now. She was 13 when she came to me, and she comes from Africa. And, you know, it's been incredible seeing that gender and race coming together and really magnifying the discrimination that she experiences. And I worked then in public health and in child protection, and that really kind of helped to consolidate for me that the barriers for many people are systemic. They're not personal failings. And, you know, it took me a long time to wake up to that myself. A major turning point for me was going to university, because my world just expanded. The kids were they were 0, 2, 4, and 6. Kyla was 6. And so it was really challenging. We had a construction company, and I worked running the office and running the administration of that, and part-time study with all these little children. And I think that, you know, I didn't even think about it then. I think you have to be really young to manage all of that. I don't know how I could do that now. But so that kind of expanded my world. And then another turning point for me was, because I was trying to do that study whilst doing all of those other things and really juggling, I didn't know how I was doing compared to other people. I'd go to lectures and then I'd leave, and I wouldn't socialize like most people do at uni. And so it was a real shock to me when I was told I was to receive the first university medal that University of Adelaide was ever awarding. And it came at a real turning point for me. My husband told me he was having an affair and was leaving. I had a major car crash with the boys in the back of the car that rode off my car, which wasn't good in a time of financial challenges. And then the top story of our house burned down. And in the midst of all of that, this crisis, the letter about the university medal came through, and it was a wake-up call for me. It shattered my belief that I wasn't smart enough or good enough, and made me think about my own privilege, because I realised that I was smarter than average and that I was lucky, that, I just happened to be born that way. And yes, I put a lot of work in, but I was lucky, and I probably should do something with my life. It was kind of a moment. I think that's the day that the letter came through was also the day, with all this chaos around me, that the dishwasher broke down, and that was really the last straw. It was the last bit of control I had over my chaotic environment, and I was like, I don't know what to do now. The dishwasher's broken down, and then that letter came through. So that was a real turning point for me. I went on. I went into academic research. I job shared. I met someone at the University of Adelaide in the library when I was researching a job, and I was talking to the librarian quite loudly about it. She came up to me and said, I think we're going for the same job. We sat down and talked, and she said, I'm still finishing off my honours. I don't really want to work full time. I said, well, I've got 4 kids. I don't really want to work full time. It was 1994, and we both said, well, why don't we go for the job together? And that's what we did, and we got the job. 1994, that was not a done thing. Job shares weren't a done thing, but we had a really great boss who said, yeah, 2 great women, and she and I have been close friends for that entire, and still to today. She was only over my house a few weeks ago while she was here from Perth. And it's an amazing relationship, but it really stood me in good stead, and it also set me up for thinking about how you could work flexibly. I was lucky enough, I set up the Leaders Institute of South Australia. Later on, I went to Sydney, and then I came back, did lots of research and health jobs, and worked in child protection role as well. Came back to Adelaide and set up the Leaders Institute, which for Victorians is the equivalent of the Williamson Community Leadership Foundation, or Leadership Victoria. And then I was privileged to go and spend some time at Harvard University, and it was there that I kind of had this confluence of circumstances where my PhD research came together with the work that I was doing with the Leaders Institute, and I knew that I needed to do this PhD. So again, I took on another period of full-time CEO, not so much parenting because the kids were much older then, and studying part-time. But in the midst of that, my oldest daughter had a brain tumor, and that kind of added stress in there. But that was a really critical kind of turning point as well, and helping her through that. And it came with other illnesses and mental health issues and so forth, as you can imagine. But it really strengthened my deep resilience, I think, and became foundational to my leadership. So my decisions at various forks in the road were really rarely about career strategy. They were a lot about values, sometimes about necessity. But the roles that I've done have been more about thinking, can I make a difference? Can I drive meaningful change? And if the answer's yes, then I kind of went for it, even if I wasn't sure how I'd make it work at the time. And mostly that's not that's worked out really well, but sometimes it hasn't. There's a couple of, there's one job in particular that I talk about as the worst job that I've never looked back from, because it was terrible, but it did still, it did still consolidate some stuff for me and make me think about what I definitely didn't want to be doing and the situations I didn't want to be in. But I've always been kind of willing to leap and learn on the fly.
I'm going to jump in because I want to ask you a couple of questions about what you've just shared with us. But what an incredible journey that you've just shared with us. Thank you. And I think that there are so many takeaways. I feel like I can't be taking notes, but I hope some of you listeners are, because I'm so inspired by what you've just said. And it was just a very brief overview, and we haven't even got to what your current role is. Well, I know we've mentioned it as the Commissioner for Gender Equality. And we'll get to that. But we have had a question come through, and I want to ask it of you now, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm sure that there are others listening who've also thought this. You've described quite a hectic period, especially in your 20s, as you've gone through, with small children and personal challenges, as well as, real career challenges as well. So many people would have folded at various points or under only one of those elements. What do you think has really created that grit and resilience? I know you spoke about some of those negative influences, but I guess were there positive drivers, do you think, as well, in terms of really being able to move forwards? Or perhaps there were also periods where you stopped and thought,
yeah. Oh, look, I don't want to smooth over the rough times. My attitude to adversity over time has grown to be, with the benefit of experience, that, this is horrible, but it won't last forever. And I had lots of adversity when I was a young kid. My mother was addicted to alcohol. She was always drunk when I came home from school. And so I had to be strong. Like, I had to look after myself. I had to stand up for myself. I had some really good teachers along the way. I also had a beautiful aunt and uncle that were wonderful. So I did have people I could turn to, but life was pretty challenging. And honestly, to be frank with you, I've had therapy, and I think everyone should have it, actually. And therapists have said to me, it could have gone either way with you, right? I'm lucky. I do probably have some, genetic resilience there. I come from a very poor family, and there's been lots of challenge there. But there's also been some success stories in there along the way as well. And I think I've got the genes, because some people don't have that resilience, and that would break them. And I feel very privileged that it's allowed me to kind of be tough in lots of ways, but also I've had to learn that not everyone is like that. And so I've had to learn to be gentle at times, because my own resilience isn't what I see in everyone else. I hope that makes some sense.
No, I mean, I think that answers the question. I think that's a really good point. It's a beautiful perspective that you shared as well. But that, even to think that you are able to have empathy and compassion for people who may not have that resilience, I think is, really quite remarkable. I want to talk about some of those successes, and I want to share with our audience, because I'm not sure whether everybody is aware that you mentioned that long history of leadership roles in South Australia as well, now in Victoria. I'm going to read this out because it's really quite remarkable, but I want to make a point. So, when you were South Australia's Equal Opportunity Commissioner, you established a free legal clinic and law internship program with the University of Adelaide Law School. You oversaw the White Ribbon Workplace Accreditation Project. You oversaw a whole of government workplace equality and respect project, which aimed to strengthen gender equality and promote safe and respectful workplace cultures across 24 South Australian public sector agencies. In 2016, you undertook a major independent review into sex discrimination, sexual harassment and predatory behaviour in the South Australian police force. and I'm going to quote this because it says, your report found that sex discrimination and sexual harassment of women and anyone else that doesn't fit the white macho male stereotype is commonplace in SAPOL, including amongst supervisors and managers. And I feel like you shared an experience with us earlier, a personal experience with the police as well, which obviously is consistent. And this is the part that I've highlighted, that you then established a restorative engagement program for the SA Police Force and delivered a 3-year monitoring and advisory program to provide guidance and audit their implementation of the recommendations in the report. I mentioned this to you before we started, but lots of leaders identify issues, lots of leaders work to address issues, and it is not common to find leaders who do all of those things. You mentioned that when you were at university, you were awakened to, I guess, the systemic nature of sexism and of gender inequality. Like I think most of us, a lot of women are at university or earlier. Very few then go on to become the Commissioner for Gender Equality in the public sector. So that role, I think that extraordinary list of achievements of identifying issues, working to resolve and implement change. Talk me through that, because you're a doer, you're not just a talker.
Yeah, it's true. And I think there is a thread there that kind of speaks to why I eventually came to Victoria for this role. I think nothing shocked me more than what we found in SA Police. I had seen that there was a similar review going on, a VicPol run by the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission here. And obviously, as commissioners, we were all connected around Australia. We met regularly and so forth. So I was hearing what was coming out of that, but I didn't, and you know, Grant Stevens, who's still the Commissioner in South Australia, he was very honest, you know, on reflection, said, we thought we'd have a review because we'd be better than Victoria. And in fact, they weren't better. They were, you know, you basically could have written the same report. They were very separate though. We didn't, there was a lot that was similar in the actual reports, but we didn't look at them beforehand. It was so confronting, and you can go and get the report if you want to. It's still on the Equal Opportunity Commission website. We can have a look at what we found, and it was really clear that. And SA Police wanted help with implementing those recommendations, and they did so. And the restorative engagement process, we set that up from scratch, where we actually took the leaders of SAPOL and we trained them to hear the stories, mostly of the women who had been harmed, and some of them, and we had to go through a whole psychological assessment process to see whether the people were actually okay to go through the process, to tell their stories, because they were sometimes so harrowing. But we wanted the leaders to hear directly from the people who'd been harmed. And so we trained Grant Stevens and all of his assistant commissioners and executive team to hear those stories. So they weren't kind of devolving it down to people lower in the organisation. They were the ones that sat there and listened to the story. So it was incredibly powerful. And all those recommendations were implemented. But I can tell you, I have a granddaughter now. This is what happens when you're a teenage mum. You also have granddaughters and grandchildren very young. I have 10 biological and 1 foster grandchild. And my granddaughter is 23, works in SAPOL as a police officer. And honestly, some of the stories she tells me could have been written in 2016. There has been a lot of change, but it takes years to change a culture like that. And unless you've got something driving that ongoing culture change, it can easily drop away when other priorities arise. And I don't think that there's been that continued investment in that change process. It was all kind of implemented, but at the top, and that change process hasn't filtered down enough. Certainly that's been my experience from my granddaughter, which has been shocking to have her experience some of those things. And she's currently on work cover as a result. So that was the frustration, I think. And you know, as Equal Opportunity Commissioner in South Australia, I would take complaints across 15 grounds of discrimination. Sexual harassment was one of them. I would see the same perpetrators or people within the same organisations over and over and over again. You'd get a complaint from a woman, generally, sometimes men, complaint from a woman, you'd settle that, you'd conciliate that, you'd get an outcome for the person, and then lo and behold, there'd be another person from that same organisation. We were tackling discrimination on an individual basis instead of doing anything systemically. And we tried to do things systemically with SAPOL, but we were out within 3 years. In Victoria, as the legislation, I was watching the legislation kind of be developed and watching with interest because it was coming up in our meetings of fellow commissioners and so forth, and I could see that this was putting in legislation that was going to hold organisations like SAPOL, the entire public sector, but in its broader sense. So under the legislation that I implement, all 9 universities in Victoria, all local councils, and there's 79 of them, every health service, 70 odd health services in Victoria, public health services, all museums, all police and emergency services, you know, you name it, are covered by this legislation. And there are important obligations. Every 2 years, they have to submit their data on their workplace across 7 key indicators, including sexual harassment and pay inequality and representation. They have to make reasonable and material progress every 2 years on those indicators where there is inequality, or explain why not, why they haven't. They have to have a gender equality action plan in place. They have to report on their progress. And the really important thing is that they have to publish their own data and their own reports. And I publish individually for every single organisation how they're going on every single one of those indicators and whether they're compliant or not, and so on and so forth. And if they fail to take action and make progress, I can start off, you know, trying to get them over the line and getting written agreements, but I can take them right to the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal and get an order directing them to comply. That basically says gender equality isn't a nice to have in Victoria in the public sector. It is a must have. And it's so important that the public sector should be the best example of gender equality. I mean, women are 50% of the world, and we shouldn't have this inequality, and we particularly shouldn't have it in organisations that are using public money. They should be institutions that we hold up in society and go, you know, our money goes there, and they're really good, and they're really equal, and so forth. And so it was the capacity to really hold organisations to account, to have them using their own data and be regularly reporting on it, that made me think I want to put my hand up for that role, because of the frustrations of what the limitations of what can be done within a sort of go in, do a review, monitor for 3 years and then get out, and then with no one monitoring it, it doesn't go any further. So I'm not saying SAPOL's not a better place than it was, but it's certainly not where I would have hoped that it would be by now.
I mean, that's very clear. What you've just outlined, I think, really kind of talks to looking at that, being able to address that systemic issue rather than, as you said, I mean, you literally just articulated that around how it's great to go in, do a review, give some recommendations, and come back in 3 years, but being able to influence and to implement that supporting structure that really aims to address the systemic challenges that we have. And I'm glad we're talking about this now, talking about about your current role, because I think it's really interesting for so many, for some of our audience tonight, but who do work in the public sector, but also I think should be interesting for all Victorians, because I don't know that many people are aware of this. And I think, like you said, we want to hold our, I would like, as a Victorian, hold our public sector to account for the highest standard.
Yeah, totally.
And the highest standard is gender equality. So within that framework, on that basis, you were just reappointed for a second term. Can you talk to us, because you are the inaugural Gender Equality Commissioner, can you talk to us, I guess, about what you you feel you were able to achieve in the first term, which was 4 years, so 2024, and then looking forward, what you're looking to really work through the next 4 years?
Yeah. We, I mean, I think so. The timing was really interesting for me. I came to Victoria in January 2nd, 2021. And I'm sure I don't need to remind you what it was like in Victoria at that time. I couldn't.
Lucky to make it through the border, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was one of those rare moments. Yeah. And I got my apartment. I rented an apartment on FaceTime. Kate Jenkins was an incredible supporter. She's here in Victoria, and she said, "Here, I'll get some people to help you," which was wonderful and made me very welcome. And I moved over with my foster daughter, and she'd just finished year 12, and she was starting TAFE that she had to do online, and she doesn't learn well online, so she was pretty grumpy and didn't really want to be locked in an apartment with me. And there I was with not a single skerrick of anything in place. I had a few staff that were all on temporary contracts, a brilliant acting director who'd been involved in the legislation, and a few people that had been involved in the legislation. But we literally had to set up the organisation, the commission, from the ground up, employ everyone online, invest millions, a couple of $1 million in a reporting platform. We had to take the legislation and operationalize it, which had never, the legislation is brand new, it hadn't been done before, and think about, well, how's that going to work? And the legislation came into effect on the 31st of March 2021, and the first obligations were due, the first lot of data, which ended up being 67 million data points that came to us, was due on the 31st of October that very same year. So I reckon just setting that up was something I'm really proud of, and I think it's an achievement in itself. We've run for each obligation round, because there was first that data, and then organisations had to use that data to develop a gender equality action plan. Then 2 years later, they had to report on their data again, and then they had to give us a progress report of assessment of how they felt they'd done. And each time we've been doing it for the first time. And I should say, I've had between sort of 9 and 20 staff at our very best. We are currently at 14 FTE, including me. So we are a tiny little organisation, and I'm so privileged to have the most amazing people working with me on all of this, because we would not have done it if everyone hadn't been incredibly committed and engaged. But we have had independent reviews. I've commissioned independent reviews of each round of obligations so that we could learn what we could do better, because we were learning along the way. And I had set up an organisation or two before. I'd been a commissioner before, but I'd never done it in a brand new state that was locked down from my living room of my rented apartment. That was a challenge. And I think we had 100%, we did have 100% compliance with that first round of data that was submitted to us. It wasn't all compliant data, but everyone submitted data. And there are 300 duty holders. So to be able to get them all actually knowing what they had to do and doing it was pretty incredible. And then we've really learnt from, the mistakes and things that we could have done better. And I think we're about to have our next round of obligations in December, and then again in May. I've shifted the deadlines for some of them mainly because of COVID and how it pushed things out. But I think we've finally got to a place where we know our duty holders really well. I've spent 3 years on the road. I've been to almost every duty holder, pretty much every duty holder in regional and rural Victoria. I spend a few days on the road, a couple of times a month, going and meeting duty holders, getting to know them, getting to understand what their reality is, but also helping them understand why we're doing this and why it's important, really trying to not just get compliance, but actually shift hearts and minds. And I think that kind of intelligence, that knowledge that we have about them, the experience and the reviews that we've had done has finally got us to a place where we know what we're doing. We're going to make it easier for our duty holders to give us what we want. And we've got a good relationship with them. You know, they don't feel confident necessarily, although some do, but they know we care about them, and we want to help them. We're not just taking a stick. But they also want to know that if their bosses don't, you know, put some money behind this and, you know, make a commitment, that I will get the stick, because sometimes there are people in organisations that are doing this work, that are doing it fairly unsupported and so forth, that have really got the weight of the organisation and this reporting on their shoulders without their bosses, you know, and, you know, board chairs and boards being over the line on it. And that's why I've done a lot of visits, because I've been out talking to chairs and CEOs to make them understand that this needs to be funded, or you're not going to make the impact. But, you know, bottom line is I do have that stick that I can use if I have to, and I've just made it clear that I don't want to, but I will do if I need to. And I think that's the other thing about this legislation, is that it does have that power, and you certainly don't see that in any other legislation, gender equality legislation or equal opportunity legislation in Australia. But I think we've had some we've had quite incredible we've made quite incredible progress, given the small number of people that are involved. Most duty holders think that we are a lot bigger than we are, and so it has been an extraordinary team effort, which has been just so rewarding for me.
I want to ask some questions, because we have received quite a few about your role, and I want to make my way through them so that we don't run out of time. And then I want to talk about the community and not-for-profit sector. So first to this one, what are you saying is the biggest challenges, both with your duty holders? They're the bodies, agencies that are required under the legislation. What do you see as what are you seeing as the biggest challenges in terms of implementation of gender equality in general in Victoria, but also implementation of the Act?
Yeah, look, I think at first, because we were doing it under in COVID conditions, it was very difficult to communicate. People were kind of just doing it as a compliance exercise. And so being able to get out, and particularly since we had the first round of progress, where we had 100% compliance with submitting progress reports and data again for the second one, but they didn't make enough progress. You could see a lot were trying, and it set things up to make progress in the future. But I also met a lot of board chairs, for example, on my trips, and they would say, well, I don't know anything about this. And I was like, well, I've been a board chair and I've been a CEO, and I know that's your governance role, is to manage the organisation's compliance with legislation. That should be on your risk register. That should be something that you are monitoring. So I then got my team to come up to find the name of every single chair of every single organisation. And when I reported back my feedback to them about their progress, I sent that directly to the chairs as well as the CEOs of the organisation. And I made it very clear that I expected better in future, and I expected this to be something that board chairs were taking notice of. And saying what I think the biggest problem is, so Hearts and Minds is one of them, but I see less of that now, and especially since I've been out sort of talking so much to organisations. I think each of the 7 key gender equality indicators are problematic. So the gender pay gap, sexual harassment, recruitment and promotion practices, gendered segregation, access to flexible work and other forms of leave that help families with caring responsibilities, and then the gender composition of the governing body and gender composition at all levels of the organisation, where you might have a lot of women at the bottom, but you see them not as prevalent at the top. All of those are things that are obviously come together and impact the gender pay gap, which is one of the indicators. And it depends on the organisations as to which ones of those are the biggest problems. So, for example, we have, as I mentioned, the health services in Victoria. They are 77% women, and yet they have the largest pay gap by far of any other industry sector in the public sector. Their pay gap is 32%, and the next largest is police and emergency services at 10%. So they are more than 3 times higher than a male-dominated sector. So there's a lot of work to be done in health services, and there's no one answer to what's causing that gender pay gap. There are lots of factors in there, and all the other indicators that I mentioned are part of that. And also our health services have a lot of sexual harassment, not just from within colleagues, but they also get it from patients and members of the public that are visiting patients and so forth. And it's a difficult problem, and it hasn't been well addressed. So health is a really important focus for us, even though it's women dominant, whereas police and emergency services in Victoria had a big cut in their pay gap. They were the most successful in reducing their pay gap over the last 2 years. So it just shows you that's probably they've had the review done by Virioc. They'd already got some things in place, and bringing the legislation in on top then meant that they were going to be held to account for the long term. So they've got on and continued that work. So it depends what you're looking at.
I want to ask you a question about health services, because actually we had a question that came through. I don't know if you can see this, but the question said, how do you impact sectors that have a significant gender imbalance? i.e. long-standing scenario of training and employing a specific gender, e.g. nursing.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up, because I think you basically just answered that, but I wanted to follow up and say, do you then work with the Department of Health, and how do you, because I mean, like you said, it's not just one problem. You're not going to one hospital or to one sector of the health department and saying this is a problem, but it's much broader than that. So how do you interact with other parts of government?
Well, I don't have resources to go and work with health. I expect health to fix these problems themselves. So they have the data. Each organisation has its own data. It has to do its own analysis, has to understand its pay gap. It then is responsible for addressing that. What we do is put out guidance. So we'll bring the best research on gender pay gaps and how to fix them together, as we have just recently and published an insights report, bringing all of that together and using the data that we've got from across the public sector. We've done another special report on sexual harassment, but we don't have the resources for us to go and solve the problems. We expect them to understand their data and then put strategies in place to address it. That's what the gender equality action plans are about. Having said that, we have done some specific work with the health sector. We've had some specific research done. I've talked to the Minister for Health. I've spent time talking to the Health Department about what they can do, and we've definitely got strategies in place. And where there are some levers that the Minister for Health can use to potentially drive change. The CEO for the Department of Health can use some levers as well. So we're in constant conversation about that. But ultimately, the fixing the problem sits with the duty holders themselves, and we provide what guidance we can to help them do that.
So that, I think that's really clear, and that's a really good example of how what you mentioned earlier about compliance really lies with the duty holder, and it should be the same as any other legislative requirement that they're required to be compliant with. I want to ask you about the community not-for-profit sector before we delve further into some more questions. We're a national not-for-profit, and we are a representative body for our Jewish community. It is, I can sort of touch briefly on this, but it's hard to. It has been historically challenging to have gender equality in community governance. I think I'm speaking about every community, to be honest, not just ours. I think it can be difficult. Religious organisations can also be difficult. How do you see, we talked about the public sector, I guess, being held up as an example for the rest of the community. How do you see that being able to be applied within the broader community? Are you aiming to be the gold standard for gender equality in terms of compliance and holding people to account? How do you see that application, if you do see it?
Yeah. We're trying to demonstrate what can be done with with legislation in Victoria to drive change that then could be translated out beyond the public sector. But as I said, we've got to get our own act in order before we preach to everyone else. All of what we do with the public sector, though, is available. All the tools, all the guidance, all the reporting templates, everything is on our website and publicly available. So anyone, anywhere can pick that up. They can follow through the steps that our duty holders have to undertake. And in fact, some of our duty holders that might merge and become, other organisations, their obligations can often stop under the Act because they're a new organisation. And many of them have agreed to continue on with the obligations, even though they don't have to do so, and provide sort of voluntary data and voluntary plans and so forth to us because they see that as a really important responsibility. So there are absolutely lessons that can be taken for every sector, I think. And I think that what I'd say is one of the tools that I haven't talked about is the gender impact assessment. So organisations under the legislation are required to put a gender lens over every public policy program or service. So anything that has a direct and significant impact on the public. And there's a brilliant book that I will recommend by Caroline Criado Perez called Invisible Women, and it's about the data absence of data and how we design, if we don't deliberately design for women and gender diverse people, that we tend to design for a standard male as default. And she's got so many examples from, vehicle safety testing, or using male crash test dummies, which means that the crash test dummies are sitting further away from the steering wheel. It's led to, for women, even though men are more likely to have car accidents, women are 47% more likely to be seriously injured and 17% more likely to die because they hit the steering wheel, they hit the airbags, etc. Public toilets, we see enormous queues outside of the women's toilets and none outside of the men's, and that is because women take 2.3 times longer on average, not because they're sitting scrolling on their Instagram feed on the toilet, but because they have periods, they get pregnant, that puts pressure on their bladder, they often have small children with them, they can't use urinals, all of that sort of thing. And we've given men and women equal toilet space. It doesn't result in equality. So it's that kind of thinking that and we've got all the tools and all the guidance, as I said, on the website. It's that kind of thinking that I think every organisation can bring to their own organisation, and it can be a revelation. So I would say absolutely don't wait for legislation. Use the data that you've got. I can't tell you how many in South Australia, how many board chairs I would talk to, because I was part of the Institute for Company Directors, and they'd say, we don't have a pay gap, we pay everyone equally. And they would look at their data and they'd go, oh my gosh, how did that happen? We aren't paying equally, etc. So use your data, have a look at it. But think about looking at leadership representation, looking at speaking opportunities, who's missing from your events and conversations, what barriers exist that you haven't noticed. One of the things that we have in the legislation is intersectionality. So thinking about how gender discrimination is compounded by things like race and disability and being a member of the LGBTIQ community, etc., etc. Think about those things. It's not hard to do. It does require a bit of work, but it's not rocket science. And as I say, with all of what we've done in terms of setting our sector up for success in this regard, that can easily be picked up and applied anywhere else, I would say.
Well, actually, on that note, and I assume, well, I guess you don't have counterparts in other states, but you're obviously very aware of what they're doing in other states. We've had a question asking, what is the difference of the actions that have been taken between South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland?
Yeah.
So in terms of complying, well, they may not always have compliance requirements, but certainly in terms of what they're aiming to achieve.
There's nothing, there's no Gender Equality Act, so there's no obligation for any other public sector to do this, although the federal public service reports to the Workplace Gender Equality Agency at a federal level. And Mary Waldron's the CEO of that agency, and I, we talk, we collaborate, we share knowledge and resources and so forth, and we debrief our challenges over lunch every now and again. So we definitely support each other. I have seen interest from South Australia. In fact, there was a bill they were drafting at one stage where they'd scribbled out Victoria and put South Australia. That hasn't gone anywhere as far as I can see. But I'd love to, I'd love to find out more about it. And I think because we've paved the way here in Victoria, organisations, other jurisdictions wouldn't need to reinvent the wheel. It could be done using our experience. I've spoken to New South Wales, the Minister for Women there, and the chief executives of government department, secretaries of government departments. I've talked to the Tasmanian Parliament. The World Economic Forum asked me to go to Washington and talk to them about what we were doing here in Victoria. They just literally Googled and saw what we were doing and invited me. I thought that they were joking, but they weren't. I was over there within 2 weeks to talk at an event that they were holding. There was interest. I spoke at Women Deliver in Kigali in 2023 in Rwanda at a global conference, and there was so much interest in what we were doing, and I've had follow-ups from other countries and so forth talking about what we're doing. So there's a lot of interest, and I think it's only a matter of time. I think we need to demonstrate results, and I think the next lot of data, I'm getting a really strong sense that we'll see a lot more progress, because we've had 4 years of organisations bedding down the things that will drive progress.
We've got one other question, which I think we've got two last questions.
Okay.
If anyone else has any more, feel free to put them in. Now's your time. This question was, is there a difference in gender equality between lesbian, gays, transgender or other females in all states being implemented, and what are the differences?
We don't define gender in the legislation, so we include people of all genders under our legislation. The problem for us is there's not a lot of data, and organisations don't tend to collect data, and bearing in mind a lot of this is based on their employees. People often don't feel comfortable sharing that data. Organisations don't collect it routinely. We are starting to get more of that now, and we're certainly we're certainly seeing organisations are focused on collecting it where it's possible. It's always got to be a choice. And so we'll have more understanding of inequality for people of all genders over time. But at the moment, we can mostly talk about men and women because of the lack of data. We do know that we've got a report that we put out in 2023 called Intersectionality at Work, where we looked at those intersections between gender and things like race and disability. As I said, we looked at LGBTIQA plus members of the community, and we did see significant disadvantage in pay gaps and so forth. With the exception of lesbian women, who did better than straight women in pay gaps, and we think that is because they have more equitable relationships around caring for children, or they choose not to have children, and so that was interesting for us. But that was the only one where we saw a community that wasn't, straight, etc., that where there wasn't more disadvantage. In fact, there was a little bit less there.
That's really interesting. Actually, that's sort of, I guess, a bit of a segue to my last question, unless anybody has any more questions. This is a question that I've been given. Some successful women have been the biggest blockers of gender equality in the public sector. They've pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, so they may not be all that forthcoming to do the same for others. And actually, you mentioned board chairs. You actually were not gender specific in the board chairs that you were talking about, but I wonder if you do see a mix, and whether you resonate with that question as
well. Absolutely. We're all brought up in a patriarchy, right? We're raised in a sea of patriarchy. I mean, let's face it, I can own the fact that until I read about the toilet queue in Caroline Criado Perez's book, I hadn't thought of the toilet queue as a feminist issue. And now it seems so obvious that it is a feminist issue. But the fact that I didn't recognise it as a gender equality commissioner is because it's just been our lives. We stand in toilet queues. And I think that this resistance from some women, and I saw it in SAPOL and I saw it in the Metropolitan Fire Service in South Australia when I did a review there. There were 15 women firefighters there, and about, a good contingent of them did not want to be part of a gender equality review because they didn't see themselves as women. They said, we're firefighters first, not women. We don't want this to be about gender. And unfortunately, and they didn't want any standards lowered because, they had literally, as your questioner said, pulled themselves up by their bootstraps and done the hard work. I think it's sad, and I do occasionally, and it's always particularly confronting when you meet a woman CEO, and I've met a few in Victoria that are duty holders under the legislation. They don't understand anything about gender equality. They blame women. They'll say things like, women don't negotiate, they should negotiate. Even though women are equally as good at negotiating, they're just less successful because we all have gender stereotypes about women who negotiate. We think they're pushy, and we're quite happy to get negotiation from men. They think it's a problem that women need to be fixed, as opposed to a systemic problem, that we need to fix a system that was designed by men for men when men were the ones that went out for work. And now what we've done is expected women to fit into that system, but with not just doing one job, but doing a second job that's full-time and unpaid at home often. And that is not going to work. And you're never going to get success, complete gender equality unless we fix the system that doesn't allow women to do all of the things that men can do quite easily. So yeah, it's particularly awful when you hear it from women, or you see that from women, but honestly we shouldn't blame them any more than men, really, because as I said, we all grow up in the patriarchy.
There's that compassion that we spoke about earlier and the empathy. Well, I think it's really quite remarkable. Thank you so much, Niki. It's been a pleasure. Moran, I'm going to hand over to you. Moran is our board member of National Council of Jewish Women Australia, as well as the co-chair of our engagement committee. So Moran, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Amy, for doing just a magnificent job and really drawing out Niki's story. Niki, we're so grateful for you for being so candid with us and sharing all the hardships and challenges that you faced, which are really significant and really very touching and moving. And we talked. You shared a lot of insights and your experiences with motherhood, in academia, dealing with heartache, with loss, marriage, therapy. And you've really shown us that you can make lemons out of lemonade, and that's a good reminder for all of us.
With therapy.
I'm all for therapy. And the importance of hard work and persevering, and also being open to opportunities that are in front of you. And it's not only your story that's remarkable, but you're really a remarkable woman, and I know that I can say on behalf of National Council, we just feel so honoured that you've shared your whole journey and everything in such a personal way with us, and we really are much better for it. So I just want to say thank you very much for sharing that with us. And I wanted to share a quote from a woman called Emma Lazarus, and she was a Jewish American poet and a very early feminist. And she wrote once, "Until we are all free, then none of us are free." And I think it's a real reminder that as women, doesn't matter, which culture, which ethnic group you belong to or where you live, we all have so many challenges, and, none of us are free until we're all free. And that really came across. So thank you very much again. We really look forward to a new relationship with you and staying in touch. And thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening, and stay in touch.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks, Amy, for the interviewing. It was great.
Thank you.